The peace dividend of the end of the Cold War is over, so said France's President Emmanuel Macron, as the world enters a new age and leaves behind the peaceful decades following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Russian bear has once more awoken and brought with it the threat of full-scale war in Europe. In the last few months, we've been highly critical of European countries and the status of their militaries, and with good reason. What used to be some of the most powerful militaries on Earth have become atrophied husks of their former selves. In some way, this is to be expected, as pretty much every Western nation stood down from their Cold War high readiness state. But in many ways, Europe has allowed its militaries to atrophy to the point it's become criminal and put an incredible burden on the United States to be the guarantor of European security. Many Americans, rightfully so, feel that Europe has been largely freeloading on the U.S.'s security guarantees. France, however, is not one of those nations. While its military is still not in great shape for a major conflict today, the Ukraine war has shown us that most nations' militaries aren't fully prepared for high-intensity combat either, including the U.S. Even so, the French military remains a competent and capable force on the continent. While once Britain's fleets and Germany's ground forces were to be feared, it's now France who's almost certainly the dominant European power in both areas. France and the UK both have around 200,000 active duty personnel, with nearly equal number of reservists, 35,000 versus UK's 37,000. The French defense budget is only $5 billion short of the UK's $50 billion budget, and yet France fields a significantly more capable military than the UK. It has just over 1,000 combat aircraft versus the UK's 663, with 226 dedicated fighter aircraft versus 119. On the ground, France does come up 5 tanks short of the UK, with 222 versus the UK's 227, while the UK takes the edge slightly on armored vehicles and artillery. At sea, the UK operates 2 aircraft carriers versus France's lone Charles de Gaulle nuclear carrier. But France has 3 smaller assault carriers while the UK has none. France also operates 4 more destroyers than the UK, though 1 less sub. So what makes France probably Europe's best military at the moment? For once, it's proven its ability to fight largely independently of any other power. For over a decade, France has been involved in a fight against Islamic extremists across Africa, and while it's had the support of the US in various ways, France has been able to operate largely independently during this protracted campaign. The UK, meanwhile, is extremely dependent on the US for logistical support, including physically moving its troops where they're needed. If a European battle royale were to break out right now, smart money's on France or Spain at the moment, not the typical military powerhouses of the UK and Germany. France was one of the first countries to wake up to the realization that the Cold War peace dividend was over and take action. President Macron has pledged over $500 billion in spending through 2030, meaning that by the end of the decade, the French military's budget would be doubled. This is especially good news for its nuclear arm, as France remains EU's sole nuclear power, but is in a bad need of upgrades and modernization. This is hardly news though, as every nuclear power is either in the middle of modernization or planning to start the process soon, having allowed nuclear systems to deteriorate since the end of the Cold War. But France was already modernizing even before the outbreak of the Ukraine war. Starting in 2020, the French military has been undergoing a 40-year modernization plan named Scorpion. France has taken a page out of the US military's playbook and is looking to adopt a similar network-centric style of warfare. In the US, this is known as Joint All-Domain Command and Control and consists of networking together various weapon platforms and soldiers. This allows the US assets to work closely together to the point of allowing one asset to spot a target and a completely different one to engage it. It's the key to the high mobility and high lethality of the US forces, and France has definitely taken notice. France calls it Combined Collaborative Combat, and it's specifically looking into information technology upgrades for its armored forces. The military is looking to bring light and medium armor platforms into current military networks, much like its heavy tank fleet. This will be an immediate force multiplier for many platforms that normally are too lightly armored to operate in the thick of combat operations. By networking them together with more survivable platforms, they can quickly engage targets and then fall back out of danger. One of the biggest upgrades is the Jaguar Armed Recon and Combat Vehicle. This vehicle is meant to replace 3 different platforms: the AMX-10RC tank destroyer, the ERC-90 Sergei Armored Recon Vehicle, and the VAB-Hot Mephisto Armored Personnel Carrier. Replacing 3 vehicles with one means incredibly more efficient logistic support, even if it's coming with some compromises. The Jaguar is not as survivable as its American Stryker counterpart, for example, but it's better prepared for World War III for one key reason: Unlike the American Stryker, the Jaguar makes use of a commercial truck chassis, meaning that it can be easily replaced during high attritional conflict. The Stryker, meanwhile, has to be built from scratch by its manufacturer. This simple fact is even more important given that war games between U.S. forces and a comparable near-peer force show that within 6 months of fighting, most of the U.S. tank fleet would be destroyed or left inoperable. In that same time, the U.S. would be lucky to replenish 20% of its losses, even with boosted production capacity. By the end of the first year of high-intensity combat, the most common vehicle used by the American forces would be a simple armored gun truck. In such a catastrophic high-intensity scenario against a near peer, France would be far better prepared to replenish losses with a capable combat vehicle compared to America. France's Scorpion modernization plan will enter phase Titan in 2030. This will run through to 2045 and have 2 different focuses. The first will be on modernizing France's heavy tanks, artillery, and combat helicopters. Advances in anti-tank munitions such as new anti-tank guided missiles or Russia's new 900mm kinetic energy penetrator for its T-14 armadas will mean that French tanks require upgrades to armor, mobility, sensors, and their own firepower. While Russia won't be fielding the T-14 anytime soon, especially after sanctions, eventually it will, or a possible adversary will field a similar threat. France simply cannot afford to rest on its heels despite fielding the very capable Leclerc. Upgrades for combat helicopters will focus on increased endurance, speed, and sensors. The Ukrainian war has proven that combat helicopters are extremely vulnerable on the modern battlefield, and better interconnectivity will allow them to operate safely in a higher threat environment. Attack helicopters are only good on the front lines, but if it becomes too deadly for them to operate, then they need to be able to speak with other military assets who could provide targeting solutions for their weapons. As the man-portable air defense threat is likely going to increase in lethality, the ability to provide precision fire support from outside the threat range of enemy air defenses is increasingly more critical. Likewise, French artillery will focus on upgrading their mobility and ability to network with other systems. The Ukrainian army has proven the deadly effectiveness of precision artillery, such as the US's Excalibur round, which allows an artillery piece to have the precision of a guided rocket or missile. While modern air defenses can do a good job of protecting from rockets and missiles, if employed properly, artillery shells are incredibly difficult to intercept, and a battery of artillery working together could easily defeat even the best defenses. But French forces have a critical weakness that needs shoring up if it's to fight a modern conventional war. The French military can pack a mighty punch, but a Rand Corporation study pointed out its biggest weakness. It has low readiness levels and lacks depth. The deployment of French soldiers to act in anti-terrorism roles inside of France, as well as ongoing operations in Africa, have put a tremendous stress on the French military. And like the US, ongoing counter-terrorism operations have eroded its edge in fighting conventional power conflicts. Currently, the French military is better geared for fighting light, mobile conflicts against extremists in Africa rather than a major industrialized conflict. To increase readiness, the French military needs to focus training on fighting near-peer foes and large unit tactics. Its military must also be geared to be effective in a highly contested environment by an opponent wielding a large amount of anti-access area denial assets. Currently, Western militaries have been spoiled by fighting in extremely permissible environments, such as sub-Saharan Africa or in the Middle East. However, to fight World War III, France must relearn how to fight without all the advantages it has enjoyed for over 2 decades. For example, a study conducted on US troops found an over-reliance on fire support by infantry. In a near-peer conflict, such fire support may not be available, and American infantry needs to be prepared to make the hard charges that their forefathers did in World War II and learn to fight without support elements if need be. If war did break out, though, it would likely be against either China or Russia, and in either case, France would enjoy the vast support of the entirety of NATO. In a conflict against Russia, France would be responsible for providing ground forces to the Eastern allies such as Poland, where it's certain that NATO's major ground campaign would begin. Its air force, one of the best on the continent, would fly alongside US forces stationed in Germany as the tip of the aerial spear in a fight for the skies over Eastern Europe, before transitioning to ground support roles after sweeping the skies clear of Russian MiGs. At sea, France's navy would be critical for either a Russian or Chinese conflict. In case of a war in Europe, French surface vessels could be used to plug the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, and thus keep Russian attack subs from striking at US Atlantic convoys, ferrying troops and equipment to mainland Europe. However, France could also support the operation to block up the Baltic Sea, a task made much simpler by the possible ascension of Sweden and Finland to NATO. In a Pacific conflict, French submarines would be of critical assistance to U.S. forces. France, like its U.S. ally, operates a nuclear submarine force. This gives them the endurance needed to assist in conflicts on the other side of the world. Given that a war with China would be certain to break out over the invasion of Taiwan, France has strong reasons to see a Chinese invasion fail. A successful takeover of Taiwan by China would leave the Chinese Communist Party in control of most of the world's microchip supply, without which a modern economy cannot function. This would leave the CCP with irresistible leverage over France and the rest of the world. French nuclear weapons would hopefully never be used, but in case of a conflict, they act as the EU's only measure of independent nuclear deterrence. While Europe is covered by the US's nuclear umbrella, meaning that America has committed to responding with nukes against anyone nuking a European city, the 4 years of the Trump presidency put into doubt the security alliance of Europe and the US for the first time since World War II. Having an independent nuclear deterrent is of significant interest for the EU. No matter the conflict that they end up fighting, French forces have proven themselves to be competent and capable. Their only weakness is a lack of depth and a serious vulnerability to becoming combat ineffective due to high attrition. This is a weakness that every military has at the moment, given that no one, except perhaps North Korea, has given serious thought to the rate at which modern combat chews up equipment and ammunition. France has seen the threat, though, and is investing in not just its military but its defense industry too. But these investments have to compete with investments in education, healthcare, and other measures that have a direct and immediate impact on people's lives. Military investments are intangible for the average citizen, up until the moment they're not, because your nation's at war. Given how unlikely war is, though, it remains to be seen just how committed the French people are to upgrading their military capabilities. Now go check out how your tax dollars are being spent with top 10 most expensive active duty military weapons, or click this other video instead.